This is a Dark Illumination Report Extra with RJ Womack.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening. This is another episode of the Dark Illumination Report podcast, and I'm your host, Brother Nero, aka RJ Womack. And today we're going to be answering a question that I had from a listener that asked me what I think about Luciferianism. And to be quite honest, I don't have a lot to say about this subject because I've never really been interested in Luciferianism, and what little bit of research I've done into Luciferianism has been a long time ago. And back during that time, I'd say probably about 10 years ago, there was only about two different groups or two different types of Luciferianism that was popular on the internet, and that was popular within certain circles. And it was either the Luciferianism where they tried to turn Lucifer into a Christian god, a creator god almost, and almost treated him as if he was almost like a Jesus figure. And then there was the other type where they just substituted the name Lucifer for Satan, and it was basically LaVeyan type Satanism or some form of modern contemporary Satanism with Lucifer replacing the name of Satan, and that was basically it. Now, since that time, we've got stuff like Michael Ford, which is not traditional Luciferianism. It has nothing to do with traditional Luciferianism. In fact, it is just modern atheism with Lucifer slapped on top of it, and where Michael Ford has created all these different traditions. He's created his own tradition, and he claims that it's Luciferianism, but it's not. In fact, he tends to speak in general terms and says, Luciferians do this and Luciferians do that, and Luciferian rituals are done this way and that way. And his rituals have nothing to do with traditional Luciferianism. In fact, there's very little known about traditional Luciferianism. The only thing that we do have is a few fragments of documents here and there, and one of those little fragments or discussions about Luciferianism can be found in the Children of Lucifer book, which you can find on Amazon. That's Children of Lucifer. I can't remember the author's name, but you can find a couple of fragments of some rituals that they did. But when I say fragments, I mean literally like a few lines from I think it was the 12th or 13th century. And that's about the only thing you can find on traditional Luciferianism that I've been able to find. So there's very little information about traditional Luciferianism. It's just like with truly traditional Celtic religions or truly traditional forms of devil worship. It's very, very difficult to find legitimate scholarly information on traditional paganism because the church did such a good job at destroying as much information about these alternative religions as possible. And most of what you find on the internet or most of the books published today are not traditional paganism, not traditional witchcraft. They're books that are basically neo-paganism, which is just modern occultism with the veneer of traditional devil worship or traditional witchcraft or traditional paganism kind of painted over it. A good example of this is Druidism. You'll see books that claim to be Druidic practices, and they're really not. They're just ceremonial magic with the name Druid thrown in it every once in a while. And they have nothing to do with ancient Druidic practices, because the honest truth is even the archaeologists and historians don't know what the Druids did. There's very little information about Druidic practices simply because they didn't have a written record. And so there is no written documents other than the Romans who kind of gave their opinion of what the Druids actually practiced and what the Celts actually did. But that's not really a fair assessment of their practices because, the Romans were their enemies. So you don't really know how accurate their accounts are. And even the accounts we do have are not very detailed. So again, when you're looking at ancient paganism of any type or traditional types of Satanism, it's very difficult to find accurate information. And if you're going to look for accurate information or try to find accurate information on Satanism or paganism, you need to look at academic research. You need to look at archaeology. You need to look at historical books written by professors, comparative religion professors, that sort of thing. Stay away from left-hand path occult books. Stay away from neo-pagan books. And if you do insist on using left-hand path books as a resource, and you do insist on using neo-pagan books as part of your research, make sure you read them only after you've read everything you can find from academic researchers, because many of the books written on Satanism, witchcraft, paganism are just wrong. And some people, they're wrong because they make mistakes. Like me, I make mistakes occasionally, but when I make mistakes, if somebody shows me where I'm wrong, I try to come on this podcast and correct them. The idea behind this podcast is not to deceive people or not to mislead people, but some of these contemporary authors in neo-paganism and in left-hand path occultism in particular, especially in Satanism, they deliberately are dishonest about the history relating to Satanism and demonology. I mean, just as an example, there's one author that is particularly popular right now, and they get a lot of praise from people. But that author specifically lies about certain things. Like, for example, they say that their religion created the rosary, or they were the originators of the rosary, and that's not true. The rosary has its origins in Hinduism and Buddhism. It does not have its origins in witchcraft or occultism. And for them to say that is nothing short of a deliberate deception on their part, because I know that author in particular, and I know they're smart enough to know the actual origins of the rosary and of the meditation beads. And I know for a fact that they know exactly where it comes from. And the only reason they put that information in there was to deliberately deceive their audience and to give themselves more credibility and to give their tradition more credibility so they can make more money. And that's why I say you have to be very, very careful about the research you do, especially when it's published by modern occult authors, specifically satanic authors, because most of them are money-grubbing con artists. They're not genuine in their belief in Satan, and they're out to make money off of you in any way possible. And that includes lying to you about the history of the satanic religion in order to sell more books, in order to give themselves more credibility, in order to take your money. And I can give you a list of names of people that do this on purpose, but I won't, because that's not the point of this podcast. My point in doing this podcast is not to call people out or not to cause friction between Satanists. It's just simply to inform younger, newer Satanists to be careful. Ultimately, it's your responsibility to verify the research, and I would recommend that anytime you study anybody's work, you try as hard as you can to verify what they're saying through at least 2 to 3 sources aside from them. And then it goes for me too. I mean, verify what I'm saying. Do your own research. Study. The idea is to educate yourself and know what you're talking about so that you won't be deceived by people who are trying to take advantage of you. As a Satanist, you have a responsibility to look out for yourself and look out for your own best interest. And if you don't study, then it's your fault if you get deceived by people. You know what I mean? Anyway, that's it for today, guys. I hope it helps. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Dark Illumination Report podcast. For the latest news headlines, show information, and more, go to rjwomack.com. That's rjwomack.com.